Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go. Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal, of course, is to show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest expert is Thalia Toha. Thalia is a business positioning and reach-out specialist. As a Princeton grad, she spent 15 years working with seven-figure national brands and S&P companies. Names you would recognize like Buffalo Wild Wings, Baskin Robbins, Panda Express. She just launched her brand new daily podcast, sharing powerful business lessons with entrepreneurs and new business owners. And in her spare time, she's a bit of a foodie. Today, she is our Modern Leadership guest expert. Welcome, Thalia.
Thanks so much for having me, Jake.
All right. Well, I can't wait to dive into all this business background and for you to help coach us entrepreneurs and business leaders. But before we do, give us a little background on the personal side. Who is Thalia Toha?
Absolutely. I've actually came here to the States maybe about 20 years ago now. And I actually moved to the States because of a civil unrest in my home country that drove me away. And my parents decided to essentially ship us over here to the States. And it was a rough couple of years. Obviously, it taught me a lot about not just, I guess, personal perseverance, but also hardship and how to deal with that. And some of the elements that I still today use in entrepreneurship and also in my business. And since then, I've obviously, after college and working in the construction industry, I've always been actually in that industry and helping, obviously now national brands, but before that, developers and also in the financial aspect of it. So quite the range as far as personal background is concerned. But it's interesting how in every single industry that I've been in and have helped, I've seen multiple individuals and really just great talents, Jake, and entrepreneurs who are wanting to do something more and something great, but having difficulty essentially positioning themselves and getting themselves to stand out, which is unfortunate because all of these talents then disappear and essentially we no longer hear of them and they just give up on their dreams. And the goal is obviously with what I do, and I love what I do, is to help people who are in those positions and just wanting a little bit of an edge here and there in getting their name out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We often talk with immigrants on the podcast here, and the story of how they built their career and built their goal setting and built their destination or kind of the path that they are going on. And if you don't mind us asking, what was your original home country?
It's Indonesia.
Right. And so you come over here at a young age, and kind of where did you land when you first got to the States?
Absolutely. So I actually, and because my parents had to stay behind and I was basically just with my sister was sent to high school, it has to be a boarding school. And just because we don't have any family members here in the States, we don't have any ties. And so the boarding and the room and board situation became difficult, and it didn't make sense for my parents to also move here. And so they made, again, the difficult decision of, we were selecting schools, we were looking at all of the options that were out there, and thankfully we're blessed with the means to afford a boarding school. Not a lot of people do. I mean, I know a lot of people who have essentially their lives destroyed because of the political conflict that we fled from. And so we landed in Connecticut, of all places, Simsbury, Connecticut, and it's a beautiful place. It's obviously, I've grown to love it, but the first year or two is so different from what I'm used to, Jake, that essentially it was not a fun time. And if you think about just teenage years to begin with, it was already an awkward phase anyway. And to then learn a completely new language, not really understand the culture, and then having to deal with all of the social aspects of it while trying to maintain academic accomplishments, obviously, and dealing with the not being around your family who's 2,000 miles away. It was all really challenging. But what I learned in that period, Jake, is actually really the power of attitude, because after a number of months, and certainly after a couple of years of being there, I discovered that everything, the way I look at things is really the determining factor to my happiness and obviously my sense of being. And so in that I would learn that I really can figure things out. You mentioned it earlier in the intro that everything is figure outable. Absolutely. And especially if you decide and you make that choice on, okay, I want to do X and I want to do Y and I don't want to do Z or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the first step into getting to where you want to be.
So as you're going down this path and you're battling, and as you were telling this story, I couldn't help but think of the teenage daughter that I have right now that's going through high school as a teenager. It's tough anyway, but you add on these complexities. During that time, you anchored yourself to obviously study hard, to work hard, to get into a great school. What was your dream at that point as you got into Princeton and thought, I'm going to make something, I'm going to do something? What was your goal or focus at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought in your daughter in this conversation. We all have people in our lives that we obviously want to teach in a certain way. And if I remember correctly, when I was going through that phase, I think it was mostly a survival mode. So I don't even know if I had any kind of long-term, I want to be X or Y and Z per se. I knew that I wanted to make an impact for sure, but I didn't really think at that point how I was going to do it and what I need to do to get there. It was really a matter of how do I make the best of not just this year, this month, or this week, but this hour, and really optimizing that particular hour that I'm in to get to the next step, right? And I think especially when you're dealing with so much information socially, academically, and personally, you really have to be selective about what you choose to manage, not just on a mindset level, but also on a performance level in your day-to-day. Because again, everybody has 24 hours, 8 hours of sleep or whatever. And so in being selective about what I choose to read, for instance, and who I surround myself with, it really makes a difference. And you hear this all the time. You're the average of 5 people that you surround yourself with, and that's true to a lot of degree because especially in that environment. I love your teenage daughter's example. I share this with my daughter as well. Now she's only 8. I tell her that, well, essentially you do have to not be selective per se, but just be conscious about who you surround yourself with and what it is that you're reading and what it is that you're doing, because what you behold, you will become.
And you say conscious, I say intentional. We have to be intentional about who we spend time with, what we read, what kind of music or movies or whatever input we put into us. We need to be intentional about it. And that's why I think podcasting and being a podcaster, but also being a consumer of podcasting, is so valuable, important, because what you're doing is you're putting in the input that's going to take you to the next level. So here we are in the story. We go through Princeton. Where do you go from there? How do you jump into this job of working with so many great brands that we all know and love?
I obviously from Princeton, I have always been in the architecture and in the construction industry. And I started out in the architecture world, actually. And then from there, I went to work with a lot of developers, multifamily developers, for instance. And from working with them, I started advising national retailers and national restaurants. And it's interesting how essentially in each step of the way, it was really a discovery of the next step. I mentioned that earlier on in my earlier career. And it really was a matter of doing the best that you can, essentially, in that particular moment. And then the opportunities and the doors that a lot of times you don't expect to have opened up. And I think a lot of people who are successful are really good at expecting the unexpected and just preparing for that opportunity, and just preparation and opportunity when they meet obviously will become success. And I think taking it one step at a time was really the key to a lot of my growth. And obviously for a lot of entrepreneurs who are listening, can relate to that as well.
Yeah, and one thing you talk about that's very interesting is this idea that it was all organic. But I think that relates back to the topic that you mentioned earlier about surrounding yourself with the right people. You know, when you surround yourself with the right people, when you're pointed in the right direction, then doors of opportunity open. And we may feel like they came out of nowhere, but really we've been preparing ourselves for them all along. And sometimes when we set goals, this is exactly what happens. We don't know specific clarity on what we want. We have a general direction that we're heading. Now, obviously, we want to be clear. The more clarity we have, the more direction that we have, the better we can get there. But sometimes when we start out, we may not know the exact particulars. We may not know specifically how we're going to get there. But that's where this opportunity of putting yourself in the right situations, around the right people, the right studies. In your case, you found yourself what felt like organic, but it was really building upon what you have done. Talk to us a little bit about that, Thalia.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting how a lot of people who find themselves in a certain situation felt like they have to go find something else outside of the situation and the function that they're in to become successful, when the fact of the matter is that you don't need to dig too far. I mean, a lot of us know about the concept of field of diamonds, in that, especially when reaching out to clients or looking for clients, for instance, you can essentially have just several people who are just really hardcore fans and really great and really believe in you and really make that matter. And they will become repeat business. They will talk about you. They will praise you. And I think that's so important, especially today with the speed of commerce, because a lot of people just want to, have 1 million followers. And that's really not the point. I think even in my Princeton days, I really realized the value of relationships, and not necessarily relationships that you think will be business, but just any relationships, customer relationships for anyone who's an entrepreneur. And it's so important to get in front and to get with the right people. And so what I do, for instance, and I teach this with a lot of my clients, is, okay, for instance, right, if you get a job and you have an interview and they ask you a question that you don't know the answer to, even if it's marginally related to, let's say, your subject matter expertise, right? So what do? A lot of people would just say, okay, well, they would come up with some answer that they're trying to kind of figure out right at that point, and they try to fake it, or they would just say, I don't know. Now, while none of them are necessarily wrong per se, it just doesn't really build upon where you already are, to your point, Jake. So how do you answer a question like that? So what I do is essentially I do a three-step strategy, what I call the strength to strength strategy. So you would say something like, and I'll give you an example of how it sounds like, and then we can break it down. Okay.
Yeah.
So you would say something like, that's a great question. I've actually been so focused on improving the other successful project or initiative that I haven't had much of a chance to look into that particular issue, but I'd love to look into that some more. What about it do you find challenging? Now, notice that this is actually a 3-part answer. The first one is that I open up with strength number 1, which is you just essentially, with confidence, you remind them about your actual expertise and specialty. And then you quickly continue with answering the issue, in that you turn and you reframe the I don't know into I haven't had much chance to look into that, which is the truth, right? It's so important to tell the truth. And then you close and you buffer it with another strength in exhibiting that you are an extra mile performer, that you're willing to go the extra mile and dig up that information that they're really wanting to find out and actually following up with it. Okay, so that's it. You're just helping them bridge that first strength to the second strength while you tell the truth, which is so, so important because you need to establish trust. And that's what I mean by getting in front of the right people the right way.
Yeah, I love this. And it reminds me a little bit of the yes sandwich. You may call this the strength sandwich, right? The yes sandwich, where you say yes to something, you acknowledge their question being a great question, or their request being a great request, but then you give a firm no, and then you follow back up with a strong yes of how you can support them. In this, the strength, handle the issue or acknowledge that the issue is legitimate, and then follow up with the strength really leaves people with this feeling of confidence in you as a performer, as you as a client, you as a coach, you whatever role that you're playing. And so I love this because when people walk away, they often forget what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And when you make them feel confidence, knowing that there is strength, the strength ratio here is 2-to-1. And so I really love this idea. I want to go back, Thalia, to an idea that you brought up a little bit earlier. And I want to tell you a quick story and get your kind of take on it. And that is, you said, sometimes we feel like in order to be successful, we need to go in a different direction, like a completely different direction. And I had this call yesterday with a lawyer who doesn't like the law, doesn't like being a lawyer, loves marketing. She wants to close down her law firm so that she can be a marketer. And I was slapping my forehead saying, do you realize that being a marketer for your law firm is a legitimate option? It's not a completely different direction, but it is a door that's open for you. And if you're really good at marketing, you're going to have a great law firm, and you can always hire somebody else to do the legal work. So talk to me a little bit about that idea of sometimes we feel like we need to go somewhere else to be successful.
Right. I love that story because every single day you hear about stories like that, right, Jake, where someone is in a certain position and they think that they need to do a 180-degree change to essentially have a certain type of freedom in their life.
Like start over completely.
Yeah,
I'm going to go in a different direction.
Right, exactly. Now, what I find interesting is that she has this, and I don't know her full story, but it sounds like she maybe doesn't. There are certain things that she might not revealing to us, right? Maybe she doesn't like the people that she's working with. I don't know, and we can't make those assumptions. And but looking and just hearing the snippet of that story that you shared. And I wonder if, and a lot of times I think a lot of entrepreneurs are making decisions because there's an element of pride involved in that, well, I have this life that I've built and maybe it's too embarrassing to continue and then quote unquote get demoted. For instance, right? We don't know that. And maybe they just don't want to assume a different role because in that field, in their mind, they are already at the top of the food chain and they want to start another food chain. I
think there might actually be one other thing in this case, and I know I didn't give you all the background for this. Obviously I know a lot more background, but I think that there's this feeling oftentimes, and this isn't just in her case, but in a lot of our cases, of this sunk cost. Like, I went to law school, I've got 3 years, I passed the bar, I've got, $200,000 in student loan debt. There's this sunk cost that I don't want to move away from because I feel like it's such a part of me.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's funny how sometimes you see that as well, even in business decision making. A lot of people make certain decisions because, well, I've already spent XYZ number of, dollars, and I'm just going to make this decision because of that. And I think to your point earlier about intentions, we have to be very intentional about what it is that's important to us and not let all of these so-called business components that are, quite frankly, obviously necessary, but it shouldn't be the determining factor, right? So I like that you brought up that example.
And I'm reminded of Mike Michalowicz's book, The Pumpkin Plan, where, if you want to build an award-winning pumpkin, sometimes you've got to cut off, you've got to remove these smaller pumpkins that are growing, that are taking up your energy, taking up nutrition, taking up whatever focus that you may have, and really just focus on what you want to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the that goes back to what you and I were just talking about earlier in the conversation, in that you have such a limited time in anything really, and time is an asset that none of us have. We don't even own it, and so to your point about the pumpkins, you have to be absolutely focused in what you do and how you do it and why you do it, and particularly why you do it. And that's also true, especially in my world, when I teach people about reaching out to other people. You have just maybe 3 seconds, definitely under 3 minutes, to get certain points across. And then obviously you build trust around that. But you don't want to essentially come off in a way that it doesn't add anything to their valuation.
Yeah, definitely. This, Talia, is a very fascinating conversation, and I wish that we could keep diving more and more into it. But alas, it is time for us to switch gears a little bit and talk about learning from leaders. This is where we get to know a little bit more about you on a personal level, aside from the business. Does that sound like a plan?
Absolutely. Let's go for it.
Excellent. So our first question then is, the book on your Kindle or bedside table, what are you currently reading?
So currently I'm reading actually one of my all-time favorites. I read this book multiple times. It is The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday, which you might be familiar with. And it is a fabulous book about, again, the power of essentially not letting your situation dictate where you're going, and instead letting yourself, being kind of the control of your life and the situation, control the next steps.
Yeah, and do you recommend listening to it or reading it?
You know what? I've always been a hard copy type of gal, but with my increasingly tightening schedule, Audible is okay. I actually prefer Ryan's style in writing, and yeah, you get so much more out of it because he writes so extremely well. And I know with Audible, a lot of people can do 1x or 2x the speed, and that just doesn't work for me. And yeah, absolutely. And so I'd rather just dive in head on into the physical copy.
Well, I would tell you, Talia, that I am a 2xer, and on Audible, you can actually do 3x. So you can really right. Speed things up a little bit. But we definitely love to pull out the Kindle and read on that as well. Our next question then is your leadership superpower.
So this is interesting because I took your quiz, and apparently mine is confidence, which is a bit surprising because I think in your quiz it was associated with Mark Cuban and Elon Musk, two really great superpowers, as obviously power figures that I haven't, necessarily associate myself with, but hey, I'll take it.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is the Leadership Superpower Assessment, which is found free on jkcarlson.com/superpower. And the interesting thing about confidence is I believe that there's two types. There's the quiet confidence, and then there's the more external or extrinsic confidence that we see. And sometimes that confidence actually would put you more into being an inspirational leader. The confident leader actually happens to be somebody who is firm in their convictions, knows what they're going after, and really is difficult to be swayed one way or the other, in that when they make a determination as a leader, they look to their followers and say, look, we're taking this hill, and I'm going to be in the front here, and I am confident that we're all going to get to the top. I'm confident that if you guys trust in my experience and my background and my expertise, we're going to get there. And so I would say that confidence is a great superpower for you, even though you may not see yourself as that same confident leader.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I love that description of it, actually.
Well, very cool. Our next question then is a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by.
So something that I live by, and this again has dated way back it's been, maybe decades that I use this every day. And that is to just tell myself to do it just one more time. I think a lot of people think that they, again, have to immediately achieve something great, something grandiose. We can't really control much of it, definitely not the future. But everybody gets to control whether they want to do it one more time, whatever it means to you, right? I mean, never mind the hustling and all these other things. Just do it one more time, right? whatever that it is, whether it's to improve yourself, read one more time, grow your business and do your marketing campaign one more time, whatever it is. And before you know it, that one have turned into hundreds, thousands, and even hundreds of thousands.
I absolutely love this philosophy and mantra, this lifestyle that you have. It reminds me of Darren Hardy, one of my favorite books, The Compound Effect. And the idea of the compound effect is this: small incremental actions taken consistently over time yield massive results. And what you're saying is, if you just do it one more time, if you just keep moving in the direction, you don't have to grow by leaps and bounds, but you have to create a steady progression towards growth, whether it's internal, whether it's external, whether it's financial, whether it's educational, intellectual, whether it's social, relationships, doesn't matter what it is. If you're making incremental steps moving forward, then you will result at a level of success higher than you started every single time. So I absolutely love that. Thalia, our final question then is the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues.
Absolutely. So this is really easy. And I know that you're a big proponent of this book as well. It is Start With Why by Simon Sinek.
Yes.
I don't remember how many times I recommend this book to people that are in business or maybe not even in business, my aunts, just random people that I encounter. And it's just so applicable to everybody, because again, I think we grew up generations now. We grew up with the notion of, okay, these are the mechanics of how to do it and what you do. And these are the steps to get there. But nobody really asked why are we doing it? Why exactly? And especially with Simon, what I love is that he breaks it down to, okay, you need to put it down on paper and write out why you do it.
Yeah, we absolutely love Start With Why around here. And I often use his TED Talk about Start With Why as kind of a gateway into getting people to read the book. And, I met somebody the other day and I said, you have got to read. And he stopped me and said, don't tell me to read Start With Why again. And I said, well, that's exactly what I was going to tell you. And you do need to do it. So wonderful. Thalia, this has been a tremendous conversation. Before we let you go, you got to tell us how we can jump on your podcast. I was recently a guest, so you could jump on, listen to my interview on your podcast, all the other great experts that you're speaking to. Tell us about that, and then how we can get in touch with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the podcast we'll be covering a lot of business strategies and entrepreneurships, obviously particularly for people who are in transition, almost like the gal that you mentioned earlier, Jake. And we'll just be covering lots of great tips, techniques, and most importantly, inspiration, and obviously reasons why we do things a certain way. So you guys can find that at thaliatohagroup.com. So that's THALIA group.com. And you can also find my podcast there as well.
Excellent. And we will link all of that up on the show notes so they have one-stop shopping where they can just go directly to it. Thalia, it has been wonderful to catch up with you a second time in the same week. You are a tremendous business leader. You've got great resources and stuff for our emerging leaders and entrepreneurs. Thank you for being this week's guest expert.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Happy to be here.
All right, my friends, and a big thank you to Thalia for coming on the podcast. As I mentioned during the show, I was a guest on her podcast. We had a lot of fun kind of switching roles as we went through the question and answer process. And of course, we will link all of that on the show notes for this episode. So if you want to listen to my interview with Thalia on the flip side, you can go ahead and do that. Of course, everything that we talked about today and every day can be found on jakeacarlson.com. This particular episode is at jakeacarlson.com/ML160160. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.